Welcome to another episode of the ASEF Podcast. In the season so far, we have explored a wide variety of topics, from physics, robotics, AI, to environmental policies, politics, and more. And for this season of the ASEF Podcast, we will focus on consciousness and philosophy of mind. Today, we will be exploring free energy principle and active inference with Karl Friston. So let me introduce our guest. Karl Friston is a British neuroscientist and one of the most influential thinkers in modern neuroscience. Currently, he is a professor at UCL. He originally trained as a medical doctor and psychiatrist, specializing in schizophrenia before he transitioned into neuroscience. He has made significant contributions to brain imaging, developing key methods which are widely used in neuroimaging research. However, he is best known for formulating the free energy principle, the theory we will discuss today. This principle provides a unifying framework for understanding how the brain minimizes uncertainty, continuously predicting and updating its model of the world. His work has profoundly influenced theories of consciousness, learning, and decision-making, making him one of the most cited neuroscientists in the history. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, it's very nice of you to have me here. And thank you for that lovely introduction. You should write my CV. I think you covered nearly everything.
Great. All right. So before we dive into neuroscience, I want to start with framing your free energy principle, or rather the free energy terminology, and viewing it from kind of all known like physics perspective, from a thermodynamics perspective rather. So I am a chemist, and I was taught that free energy refers to the energy available to do useful work. And in thermodynamics, maximizing entropy leads to minimizing the free energy. So, for example, a cup of coffee with milk. So at first, the milk and coffee are separate, but over time, they naturally mix. And the system moves towards maximum entropy, a more uniform, but you use this free energy term very differently. It is used to describe the brain minimizing uncertainty. So in the brain, the goal isn't to just kind of like passively mix incoming information with what is already there. I'm also not sure if this is correct analogy to use, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, it is actively making predictions to reduce uncertainty about the world. So how does the free energy principle frame the brain's functions? And can you clarify this concept for us?
Yes, of course. I love that example with the cup of coffee. I think we should just drill down on that as a nice example. But to answer your question, and I should say it's refreshing to talk to somebody who knows about chemistry and entropy and computational chemistry, I presume. There's a very close relationship between thermodynamic free energy and the variational free energy that underwrites the free energy principle. The distinction is that the free energy in the free energy principle refers, as you intimated, to measurement and observation of one system of another. So the probability distributions that we're talking about here that have the attribute of entropy are probability distributions entailed by an observer, say you or me, about the things that we are observing, the rest of the world. And I frame it like that because you could look at this variational free energy as not pre-physics, but certainly pre-thermodynamics, very much in the way that E.T. Jaynes formulated his maximum entropy and maximum caliber principles. So those were formulated as a description of physics as measurement. And I would read it as physics as inference, that I got a measurement, I am an observer, or I have a measuring instrument, which is me and my body. And all that we need to know in terms of understanding physics is the nature of that measurement. So if you apply James's maximum entropy principle to the process of measurement of things like a brain, then you get the free energy principle. And in fact, there are people, my friend Dalton says that they are dual. I think the key thing to bear in mind is that the maximum entropy principle operates under constraints. So it's a constrained maximum caliber or maximum entropy principle, the caliber being just the entropy of paths as opposed to instantaneous states. Those constraints are exactly what you're referring to in terms of the brain trying to provide accurate predictions of its measurements, of its sensory states. So that accuracy can be scored by prediction error, for example. But generally speaking, the accuracy are the constraints in the constrained maximum entropy principle. So it's not just entropy. There's always entropy and something else. And of course, the very structure and the functional form of free energy is, as you intimated, it is just the amount of available work that is equal to the expected energy minus the entropy. So if you want to minimize free energy, you have to maximize the entropy, but also at the same time, you'll ensure that the total entropy is constrained. In other words, that we have an accurate account when we're applying the free energy principle to inference or measurement systems. So I think that everything you said is it could equally apply both to the thermodynamic free energy and the variational free energy. It's just that the variational free energy doesn't commit to the assumptions of thermodynamics. It doesn't have any Boltzmann's constants. It doesn't have temperature at this stage. It's just a description of any system that self-organizes to technically a non-equilibrium steady state. And that's important because most of the 20th century physics that you will have done at school pertains to closed systems that have equilibrium steady states. But we're now talking, because we're talking about observers and measurement, there's a distinction between the measurer, the brain, and the thing that is being measured or observed. And that distinction means that the observer is now open to influences from the observed and can also influence the observed. So this system now is technically open to its environment or its heat path or to whatever constitutes the rest of the universe. So now we move from equilibrium physics to non-equilibrium physics and the physics of non-equilibrium self-organization, but the same rules apply. As time goes on, the free energy will minimize, and that will generally entail an increase in the entropy. The entropy, though, is an attribute of the probability distribution about the outside, about the causes of the measurement or the observation. So what would be the average? How could you read that sort of in a vernacular sense? Well, if I've got a high entropy belief, that basically means I'm uncertain. So you can also just summarize the free energy principle as that systems will self-organize to resolve their uncertainty about the cause of their sensory input or the news that they receive from the world. The maths is identical, though. You can derive thermodynamic free energy. You can also derive most of, in fact, if not all, of stochastic thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, quantum mechanics, and even classical mechanics are special cases of this sort of more generic information theoretic description of physics as measurement. Does that help?
Yes, absolutely. So, as we said, at its core, the free energy principle says that the brain is always trying to minimize surprise, or as you said, more technically, prediction error, and while interacting with the world. And in your work, you also emphasize that surprise has a specific technical meaning. Can you clarify that?
Yes, of course. So technically, surprise would normally be called self-information and information theory, and it's very simple. Again, if I'm getting too technical, tell me. But you did say you've done the physics of this, so that's great. Technically, it's just the negative log probability of some sensory exchange or some exchange with the environment. So if we're talking about creatures or biotic self-organization, it would be the sensory impressions that this particular milieu or eco-niche or environment is impressing itself on the system. So the surprising question is just the implausibility of some system being exposed to these inputs, as scored by the negative log probability of those inputs given the kind of system that it is. And I would interpret that as either conditioned upon me or me as a model of my world, of my sensed world. So surprise is, if you like, a vernacular description of that. You could also call it surprisal. So Tribus also casts this self-information, the negative log probability of an event as surprisal. And the nice thing is that the average of surprise, average of self-information, either over time or over an ensemble, is the entropy. So in minimizing surprise in the moment, and if you maintain or always try to minimize surprise over time, or whilst pursuing a path through your state space, you are also technically minimizing the entropy of your sensations. That can sound paradoxical because we just said this is consistent with the maximum entropy principle. But remember, the entropy that is part of the maximum entropy principle is the entropy of the beliefs about the causes of your sensations. So there's this beautiful yin-yang, that systems that try to keep their options open or their minds open, if you like, in terms of explaining the causes of their sensations beyond their sensory blanket, their sensory veil, are at the same time, or will look as if they're trying to minimize the dispersion or the dissipation or the spread or the entropy of their sensory exchange with the environment. So that yin-yang, I think, is important to understand. When people talk about the maximum entropy principle, they are talking, or the free energy principle, the entropy in mind, or the entropy that's being referred to, is the entropy of probabilistic beliefs about something else, not the actual system itself. And I should also say, before you tell me off, that when I talk about beliefs, I, again, like surprise, it has a very technical meaning. So when I talk about a belief, I just mean a conditional probability distribution. So in my world, that would correspond to a Bayesian belief, in the spirit of Bayesian belief updating or belief propagation. So this is a crisp and mathematically precise meaning, and it is that belief that has the attribute of things like uncertainty or dispersion or entropy or content. So surprise is not the kind of surprise you get when you open your unexpected birthday present. That's a very different kind of surprise. That's usually a good surprise. Surprise is just the kind of surprise you would get if you found yourself experiencing very uncharacteristic sensations, such as being on fire or underwater or in pain or at -5 degrees centigrade. So it's a very pragmatic kind of surprise that is more apt to describe things like homeostasis. I would be very surprised to find some of my physiological variables outside those viable ranges that are consistent or characteristic of the kind of thing that I am, the phenotype that I am.
Now it feels very appropriate to also bring up the question, why do we actively seek new experiences? Why do we explore, travel, take risks? It seems very counterintuitive to this minimizing surprises theory.
Yes.
So if minimizing surprise is the goal, why would somebody decide to go skydiving, right? But also maybe by exposing ourselves to new situations, we actually then build better predictive models. So in the long run, we are better able to handle the uncertainty. So could you maybe explain this a little bit more?
Yes, of course. That's an excellent question. And the answer actually appeals to this sort of yin-yang we were talking about before, but the uncertainty encoded by our beliefs is always trying to get bigger, whereas the uncertainty about our sensations is always going to be smaller and smaller. We're always going to be resolving surprise in that sense. But what you're talking about technically is sometimes called Bayesian surprise. And the key move to resolve this apparent paradox is just to reflect upon the words you used when talking about seeking novelty. By doing things, and you're absolutely right, the things that we do are in the service of building better predictive models or generative models that can generate predictions that underwrite the prediction errors. So what you've done, you've brought something extra to the table when you're asking questions about how we act in order to gather the sensory impressions that we want to keep within these viable limits. Action now speaks to this two-way traffic across the things that separate me from the rest of the universe. So we've been talking at the moment about how the universe, the world, influences me through sensory input. But I also have to think now about how I influence the world through acting upon the world. So what are the imperatives for action? Well, if I am the kind of thing that minimizes the surprise of my sensations, i.e. minimizes my prediction errors, then I'm going to commit to those actions that minimize expected surprise. Now, what's expected surprise? Well, we just said it's entropy, uncertainty. So what that means is I will be the kind of active organism that, or phenotype or creature, particle, person, population, anything that can be disambiguated from something that is not that thing. I will act in a way in which I'm going to minimize the uncertainty that is the expected surprise. What does that look like? Well, it looks like I'm going to be novelty seeking. It looks like I'm going to be information seeking. So when you write down the expected free energy or the expected surprisal, you now have, I think, quite a beautiful expression that subsumes two kinds of motivations for my behavior. In exactly the same way that the free energy can be decomposed into a total energy and an entropy, and we can rearrange that in terms of accuracy and complexity. For example, if I was a statistician, the expected free energy, which is now an expectation or an average under what I think I will sense, the outcomes that I expect to experience. If I did that, then we have a decomposition that can be variously read as risk minus ambiguity or expected information gain minus expected cost. And I think it's the expected information gain you're talking about. You're talking about why we choose to do this, to act in this particular way. And by acting, I mean ranging from just looking over there to resolve uncertainty about what caused this flicker in my peripheral vision, through to carefully choosing what social media or which news channel to gather my information to resolve my uncertainty about states of affairs in the world at every level. So these are both aspects of sentient behavior, which we call active inference, where you're making inferences about data or sensations or inputs that you are actively in charge of gathering. And there's a nice story about self-evidencing that I could tell here. Perhaps we don't have time. But to come back to, what would it look like if I always chose to act in a way to minimize my expected free energy? What that would mathematically translate to is two kinds of minimization of expected surprise. One kind is the literal interpretation of expected surprise as uncertainty. So I'm going to try and minimize my uncertainty, resolve my uncertainty. That conforms with the Bayesian principle of optimal experimental design, which is I am going to design an experiment by looking over there or by doing a scientific experiment that's going to yield data that maximizes the information gain in terms of resolving my uncertainty about this hypothesis relative to that hypothesis. So this was elaborated in the 90s by people like Dennis Lindley, and then came again to the fore in the context of active learning by people like David McKay, and it's a fundamental component of the expected free energy that explains novelty seeking, sensation seeking, and all of those things that equip you with the right kind of information so you can build a better model, a better generative model of your world. Just to complete that story, the other part, so I repeat, in the same way you can sort of divide free energy into energy and entropy, you can divide expected free energy into expected information gain and expected cost, or reward, if you like. What is that? Well, that expected surprise, or part of expected surprise, is certain outcomes I would find very surprising. We're talking now exactly about the sort of homeostatic surprises, that if I do this and I find myself on fire, that would be very surprising. And therefore, the expected surprise about by igniting myself would preclude me from taking that particular action. So there's this sort of pragmatic utilitarian aspect of expected free energy, sometimes described in terms of the extrinsic value, as opposed to this more epistemic novelty-seeking, information-seeking part, which is sometimes referred to as an intrinsic motivation, an epistemic motivation, the epistemic value that underwrites foraging for information as opposed to foraging for non-surprising, non-costly, familiar, comfortable outcomes such as being rich and loved and everything else that you might find rewarding.
One of the key concepts in your work is also Markov blanket. So this is a mathematical way to define the boundary between a system and its environment. Could you explain what Markov blanket is and why is it crucial for understanding the brain?
Right. Another wonderful question. I've actually slipped in a reference to a blanket earlier on in anticipation of that question. So remember before we were talking about the universe, the world impressing itself on my sensory veil, on my sensory blanket. I was referring explicitly to the Markov blanket. So the Markov blanket is a statistical construct introduced by Pearl in the context of graphical directed acyclic graphs that also emerges when one thinks about the statistical dependencies in the context of random dynamical systems. So, put simply, the Markov blanket is basically the inputs and outputs to a system. And they sort of stand alone as intervening between everything that's going on the inside, the internal state, say, of my brain, and everything that's going on the outside of these blanket states that would correspond to states of affairs in the world that are causing my inputs. So my inputs are now sometimes referred to as the sensory sector of my Markov blanket. But before, remember, we were saying that there's when we think about non-sessile, when we think about biotic self-organization that would apply to you and me, we also have to have the inside acting upon the outside. And that means that you've got this bipartition of the Markov blanket into the sensory sector and then the active sector. So the active states are basically the outputs, and it's that which induces the openness we were talking about. And interesting, a kind of circular causality, because the inside is influencing the outside through the active states or the active part of the Markov blanket, and the outside is influencing the inside through the sensory sector or the sensory states of the Markov blanket. So, to take a sort of concrete example, your sensory states could be, and I should just add that, for any given system, there are Markov blankets at every scale. There are an uncountable number of Markov blankets depending upon the scale you want to identify. So every cell in your body would have a Markov blanket. Every molecule in that cell would have a Markov blanket. Every organ in your body would have a Markov blanket. You have a Markov blanket. Your family, your educational institution, your culture will have a Markov blanket. But let's just pick you as, what is your Markov blanket? Or be more specific, let's say your brain. So what's the Markov blanket to your brain? It's just the inputs and outputs. So what are they? Well, they're basically your sensory epithelia, your sense organs. Everything that I can change in order to produce changes on the inside of your brain. And that's basically all your sensory receptors, ranging from all your receptors, say, in your gut or your gut feelings, through to vision, through to all the cells on your retina and your eyes, through to hearing, and all the sensory modalities that we are gifted with by evolution now constitute the sensory sector of a Markov blanket. So what about the action? Well, there are only a very small number of ways you can change them. I'm tempted to ask you what they are, but I'll give you the answer and see if you recognize it. You can only change the world, you can only act on the world by contracting striated or smooth muscle or secreting something. There is no other way that you can change the world, whether it's through talking, moving your voice box, or whether it's writing, moving your fingers, or whether it's releasing hormones into your bloodstream. From the point of view of the brain, the only way you can influence the world is by changing through your actuators that could be autonomic reflexes or motor reflexes, your body and your body in that world. So from the point of view of the brain, the body is now out there. It's something that has to be inferred. It's something that has to be measured, observed, and deployed according to your generative model of the consequences of the actions of your body, of the movement of your body. So that's what the Markov blanket is. Basically, it's a mathematical description of how we can separate one thing from everything else, and it just defines it in terms of this two-way traffic between the inside and the outside. And the very existence of that blanket leads to the free energy principle. Because now you've got a separation between the inside and the outside. You can now talk about the beliefs of the inside about the outside. And that's, if you like, the bright line between this pre-thermodynamic kind of variation free energy introduced by Richard Feynman, and the free energy of statistical physics and stochastic mechanics and statistical mechanics, because the probability distributions that people talk about in physics and statistical mechanics are probability distributions about an ensemble of things. There's no distinction between the thing and the probability distribution. But as soon as you've got a Markov blanket, you can ask some really interesting questions now about how the inside relates to the outside through this notion of probabilistic inference. And again, I repeat, one can apply things like the maximum entropy principle to understand how the inside effectively measures the outside or observes the outside, and indeed, symmetrically, how the outside observes and measures the inside, how the environment learns about you through this circular causality, through these action perception cycles.
This is very, very interesting. Because it's sometimes it's like perception is kind of controlled hallucination, which would be kind of like tightly constrained by reality, with like receiving all of these inputs and then reacting on them. But in fact, also like the environment is receiving inputs from us, and yeah.
Are you saying the environment hallucinates as well?
I don't know, a two-way hallucination.
Well, just pursuing that, given that the theme of this series of podcasts is consciousness, in a sense, I think you could say that. I think first of all, I think you're absolutely right that one way of looking at this process of measurement and inference, which is just building probabilistic explanations for the causes of my sensations, which are always going to be hidden behind my Markov blanket. They're not directly observable. So everything really is just a Bayesian belief structure that is a fantasy, it is a hypothesis, it is an hallucination that is somehow constrained. It's the best explanation for the sensory evidence for the thing that I am hallucinating. But they're always very good hallucinations, or as good as one can make them. That's the whole point about minimizing free energy or maximizing the evidence for your predictive models or your generative models. So I think that's absolutely right. But if we just pursue that, that means that the environment is also hallucinating about you. And I think if you now recognize that your environment includes me, then it is absolutely true that I can only hallucinate about you, because I can never get behind your Markov blanket. So I can't only make inferences about you. I can't know you. I can't be you. I can't be your brain, because your brain is behind the Markov blanket. And if I destroy the Markov blanket and look underneath the Markov blanket, I destroy you, because then you wouldn't be separable from the universe. You'd dissipate into the universe. You would dissolve, die, and a whole host of other nice D words. So I can never know you, but I can make inferences about you. I can measure you. And of course, one deep inference that I could make is that you are conscious, but I will never know that, because you are hidden behind your Markov blanket. So in that sense, I am hallucinating about your consciousness, and that is exactly a nice illustration of the symmetry of these things. What applies to the inside also applies to the outside.
So since, of course, now we are talking a little bit more about consciousness, and our previous guest on the podcast was Philip Goff, and he is a panpsychist. And so the idea of panpsychism is that consciousness is fundamental property of the universe. What would you say, looking at that theory from your perspective?
Right. Well, my perspective is as a physicist and a biomathematician, and I would see those kinds of phenomena as a manifestation of something called generalized synchrony or synchronization of chaos between two coupled systems that are sufficiently similar in their construction to do shared inference on a shared world. So the notion of generalized synchrony inherits for example, from the observations of Christian Huygens about clocks, that sort of the only non-equilibrium steady state that they can possess is when they're in synchrony, when they're oscillating, or their pendula are oscillating in synchrony. This is a free energy minimizing solution, because one clock is open to the other clock because it is loosely coupled through hanging on the same wall or hanging on a beam. That is the Markov blanket. So as soon as you have a Markov blanket that separates two things, then the free energy minimizing solution if those things are sufficiently similar, is to evince a generalized synchronization. What does that mean? Well, if we now interpret the internal states that are now synchronized of two things, so that one thing provides the world from the point of view of the other thing as entailing or encoding Bayesian beliefs, what we are saying is that these two people now are going to be sharing and have synchronized belief structures in virtue of a shared sensorium. So it's perfectly plausible that you will get this I'm trying to avoid the word spooky, but it's certainly plausible mathematically. In fact, it could not be any other way from the point of view of the free energy principle, that two systems that have learned to interpret their world under generative models with a sufficiently similar structure, for example, two people, in observing the same sensorium or the same world, will inevitably have a synchronization that would look very much like somehow I knew what you were thinking and you knew what I was thinking, and therefore it is what we think. So mathematically, it's neither owned by me or you. It's now distributed. But notice there's always a separation between the two in virtue of having the Markov blanket. So the Markov blanket both separates but also merges. It also glues things together. And in gluing them together, certainly from the point of view of an information theoretic description, you could now say that this generalized synchronization across all the things that are separated by Markov blankets are themselves juxtaposed and therefore have a generalized synchrony, which you could say was in some way a distribution of the belief dynamics. And if you would now want to describe consciousness or the process of consciousness as belief updating, then certainly there will be a distribution and a federation of that belief updating process. Does that help?
And in the meantime, I just thought that then maybe Markov blanket would also be kind of a good analogy for, and now I cannot remember what exactly the term is, but is it from Jungian psychology? Is
the collective unconscious?
Exactly.
Yes.
So yeah. And then I had another kind of example that I've written down for myself, which I feel like was explained well with surprise that we were talking about before, but maybe I can read it and then you can tell me if perhaps I understood something wrong or you can add something to it. So if we have this example of, let's say I'm stepping on a crosswalk and I see a car approaching, my brain doesn't just react to where the car is now, but it simulates where it will be in a few seconds. So this kind of model kind of seems very important for survival. And this is a part of this evolutionary consciousness theory where a person who said this, they said that consciousness evolved to simulate the future. And I feel like this also kind of fits into, as I said, the free energy principle and the surprise that we were talking about before.
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. And in a sense, that is a natural explanation that emerges from your other question, which I responded to by saying, once you put action into the mix, then you have an explanation for motivation and behavior. But before we do that, you're absolutely right that the generative model has to be equipped with the capacity to roll out into the future to evaluate the expected free energy. So it has to have a generative model or a predictive model of the consequences of action. And of course, before you've acted, those consequences don't exist. They're a random variable, and that's why you have to take the expectation to get the expected free energy. But crucially, I think the point you're making here is that a small number of self-organizing systems, things like you and me, are privileged in the sense that our generative models include a generative model of the consequences of our action. And by definition, that means I have a generative model of the future. So my generative models are now prospective and future pointing. In a way, I wouldn't need that if I was a thermostat. But if I want to plan ahead, if I want to evaluate, what's the least surprising outcome? I stay here until the car hits me, or I jump aside and let the car go through. The only way I can do that is if I have a generative model of the future conditioned upon this action or this plan or another plan. So I think you've brought, something quite fundamental to the table, that there's a bright line between self-organizing biotic systems that do and do not have a model of the future. And I think that bright line is a distinction between things that do and do not have authentic agency. And I suspect you're going to go on to argue that to be conscious, you have to be an agent. You actually have to have a model of yourself in the lived world, which means you have to have a model of the consequences in time, in the future, of the actions. And once you've got that, of course, you now have a nice mathematical picture, because I'm now going to be evaluating alternative plans, policies, actions, courses of action, which means that, and then I'm going to have to select one which has the smallest expected free energy, or the greatest expected information gain, or the smallest expected cost. And in so doing, I am now an agent that's now selecting my own future. I am now actively, in a willed way, you can read this in terms of free will, I am now responsible for authoring my future, which is private to me, because I'm behind my Markov blanket and no one else can get to me unless they break my Markov blanket. So I think now we're getting much closer to the kinds of generative models you would need for a very minimal kind of selfhood. But certainly what you would need to be called an agent. I think most people would argue that to be conscious would entail agency. And I think what you're saying is, to be an agent, I have to do things, not only that, but I have to choose among counterfactual things that I could do. And therefore, that choice rests upon a predictive model of the future, conditioned upon action. That's a really important point.
Yeah, and we will also come back to the notion of free will a little bit later. But before that, yesterday, during my evening walk, I was thinking about potential correlation between assembly theory that was proposed by Lee Cronin and your free energy principle. And yeah, so this theory in chemistry, so Lee Cronin is a chemist from University of Glasgow, that is called assembly theory, which basically looks at how complex structures like molecules or living systems emerge through sequences of assembly steps. So the more complex the object, the more steps in its assembly history. So I wondered if there is a link to your free energy framework. Could life, or either consciousness itself, be seen as arising from these kind of structured assembly processes, where minimizing free energy acts as kind of constraint, shaping these assemblies, shaping which assemblies are possible?
Yes, I think so. But I think you probably have to lift the argument to an evolutionary scale. So now I'm talking about assembly as an evolution of the phenotype that during its lifetime is trying to minimize its free energy through active inference and Bayes optimal decision theory and epistemic foraging and everything that we've been talking about. But the same free energy minimizing process also occurs at a much slower time scale, at an evolutionary time scale. You could also argue it occurs during neurodevelopment as well, but I think we just focus on assembly theory. So what does that mean? Well, it means that I can understand natural selection as Bayesian model selection. And Bayesian model selection is the process by which you take this hypothesis or this generative model or predictive model and select it because it has the greatest model evidence in relation to the data that it has been trying to explain. On an evolutionary level, that model evidence can be read as the adaptive fitness. It's just the probability of this sensory exchange with the eco niche given the model, which is the phenotype. So it's just the likelihood of finding this kind of phenotype in this kind of eco niche. So Bayesian model selection now becomes an apt description of natural selection. And of course, the free energy, if you remember, in the service of minimizing surprisal or surprise, that's the negative log of the probability of the sensory exchange given a model. So minimizing surprise is the same as maximizing model evidence. And if model evidence is adaptive fitness, then you can apply exactly the same free energy minimizing principles to evolution in the spirit of Bayesian model selection. So what would happen if you had an ensemble of phenotypes who were all exposed to Bayesian model selection via evolution, in the circular causality way we were discussing before, where I am acting upon my world, I am actively making my world as predictable as possible to minimize my free energy during my lifetime. I will be therefore co-constructing my eco-niche with all my conspecifics in a way to make it more predictable. And that means that as part of my generative model, I'm going to have a model of you so that we can co-construct our world, which means that there's going to be a natural progression and complexification at each stage of natural selection at the evolutionary stage that inherits just because there is a population of things that can co-construct their shared environment. So I would read a ongoing process of evolution as Bayesian model selection in the special instance of the things that have been selected all coupled to each other and co-constructing their environment as the process or the mechanics of the kind of assembly that one could see at a molecular level or a chemical level in terms of assembly theory. So that would be my reading of it, just in terms of self-organization. I am aware that you could also put a thermodynamic explanation for this, of the natural complexification that you get read in terms of exchange of entropy and entropy across the Markov blanket of molecules or cells, or any system that starts to show complicated structures that can be assembled in a recursive fashion at different scales. One way of reading that in terms of another manifestation of free energy minimization, which is just an emergent property at any scale, including evolution, would be rest upon another rearrangement of the information theoretic terms of free energy. So we've said that free energy is equal to total energy minus entropy, but you can just rearrange the terms and express it as complexity minus accuracy. So if I now read the complexity, technically a KL divergence between my prior and posterior beliefs. If I now read that complexity as the degrees of freedom I am using up to explain my lived world, then what I will be doing at an evolutionary timescale is minimizing the degrees of freedom. And that generally leads to a sparser structure. And that sparser structure has a particular structural complexity, which I think is also an important aspect of this, the kind of complexity that you were talking about in terms of assembly theory, that there's a specific path to a complex structure that, in virtue of being a very specific path, has a certain sparsity to it, in the sense that there are not multiple routes to the same thing. And that allows me also, just heuristically at least, to make the point that the free energy principle is just a principle of least action. So it is literally, once you cast the objective function in the moment as a free energy, as a process of inference and active inference and decision making, appreciate that I'm doing this as a function of time, then minimizing free energy at every point in time is exactly the same as minimizing the path integral of my free energy, which is a free action or an action. So I will choose those paths into the future, or the free energy principle suggests it would look as if I am choosing my paths into the future that have the least action. So the path of least effort. And that path is one of a large number of paths, and therefore has a particular sparsity. So there's one trajectory that is the path of maximum efficiency, minimum effort, or least action. And I suspect, though I don't know, that path of least action perspective may be one way of understanding that there is a particular route to assembling structures in a particular way, which you cannot deviate from. And if you did, you'd literally end up with highly implausible structures or assemblies. I don't know enough about computational chemistry to answer, but my guess is you could probably link them at that level.
Wow, that was a brilliant explanation. But now I also want to go a little bit into your a career as a physician, and also connect a little bit patients with schizophrenia with perception. So how does schizophrenia involves significant disruptions in percepting and reality testing, which kind of leads into incorrect perceptions of the world. Yeah, and how could this result in problems with brain minimizing free energy or making predictions about the world?
Right. I think the answer to that relates very much to your introduction of the notion of controlled hallucination. So if our perception of reality just is a reflection of our belief updating as part of this free energy minimizing process, then all of our reality is inside, and it is an inference, it is a fantasy, it is an hallucination. It's not to say there isn't an outside. I'm not proposing a radically skeptic position, but the actual content of our beliefs are probabilistic. There is no sort of if you like definitive reality at hand. And that's very useful, I think, just to understand the way that we make sense of our world. It is both private but at the same time we try and share it as much as possible. Certainly if we share the same environment or world or culture and language. But it also tells you that sometimes there can be a disconnect between the actual environment out there and your beliefs about that environment. So that's quite important when it comes to understanding psychopathology and suffering of the kind that you might get in neurological and psychiatric disorders. Furthermore, I think it's important to realize that having a principle of least action, which is the free energy principle, which is a physics of belief structures. It's a physics of information. It's not a physics of thermodynamics or classical mechanics. It is a physics that applies to belief structures, sometimes known as Bayesian mechanics, is important because it allows you now to talk formally, mathematically, about somebody's beliefs, which of course is what people with psychiatric problems need to talk about. And certainly if you're describing somebody with psychiatric problems, you have to talk about what they believe. So the utility of the free energy principle when applied to psychiatry is simply because it is all cast as a physics of somebody or something that is measuring, inferring, hallucinating, making sense of, navigating actively their particular world. If one pushes that analogy and not analogy, but if one applies the free energy principle to understand psychopathology and the symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions, one identifies a particular mechanism or failure of Bayesian mechanics that could easily explain them. But perhaps it's best just to sort of step back and just ask, well, what is an hallucination? What is a delusion? What are these manifestations of psychotic experiences? Well, they're just false inferences. So if you remember, again, probably at school, if you remember doing statistics, you have type 1 and type 2 errors. Mm-hmm. And then the type 1 errors, you're smiling, but you're not nodding. When you do a t-test, you can make one of two kinds of errors. You can either infer that your result was significant when it wasn't, so that would be a false positive, type 1 error. Or you can infer something is not there when it was actually there, and that would be a false negative. So these are both these are false inferences of type 1 and type 2. And of course, that's exactly what you see in psychiatry. You either get people who infer things are there when they are not, type 1 false inference, such as hallucinations and hallucinosis, or delusions, beliefs about intentions of other people that are not evidenced by the evidence at hand, or type 2 errors, where you infer something is not there when it is. And then you're talking about sort of dissociative syndromes, neglect syndromes, what is called hysterical syndromes, where you're not aware of something, say, happening in the left half of your visual field, for example. So all of these symptoms and possibly signs of psychiatric and several neurological conditions can all be framed as false inference of one type or another type. And then you ask yourself, well, how could you make a false inference? What's the most easy thing to break when making false inferences? And interestingly, the answer is very particular, a very precise answer, and I mean that literally. It's in the precision of your beliefs that underwrite your inference. So if you're a statistician doing a t-test, for example, you will measure the difference between two groups, say their height or their response to a particular drug. And then you ask yourself, okay, this difference has a particular effect size. I'm now going to make an inference that it is significant in relation to the variability. And the variability is scored in statistics in terms of the standard error, for example. And the inverse, and then you use that as a yardstick to ask whether there is a difference between this and that. And basically what you do is you divide by the standard error, or you multiply by the inverse of the standard error, which is the precision. So your t-statistic now has two bits to it. It's the measurement of some difference times the precision of the data you used to measure that difference. So precision itself has to be inferred. You have to measure the precision itself. So the precision now becomes a very delicate target for psychopathology. And there are several reasons why you might propose that to be the case, depending upon whether you're a theoretician or a psychopharmacologist or a psychologist. So precision in this instance, technically, it is the inverse entropy or the negentropy of any belief structure. And this could be a belief at a very low level about sort of the quality of some sensory percept. And if you have a very precise belief structure, then it's usually going to contribute more to belief updating in deep inference or deep generative models. In predictive coding schemes, this is usually expressed in terms of precision weighted prediction errors. So predictive coding is one particular instance of belief updating under simplifying assumptions about the nature of uncertainty and the functional form of the probability distributions, so that you can write down the uncertainty in terms of precision weighted or precisions that then weight the prediction errors. So on this view, the predictive coding view, prediction errors update your beliefs deeper in your brain or higher in your deep or hierarchical generative models. But they only do that if they are predicted to be precise. So what would happen if I broke my precision estimation? Then if I was a statistician, I would now get very, very odd t-tests, because sometimes I've been multiplying the difference between a value and precision was too big or too small, leading to false inference of type 1 or type 2. If I was a person and deployed precision in the wrong way, that would afford too much weight or precision to certain sensory channels of sensory evidence that are going to have a profound effect on my belief updating. So, for example, if I assign too much precision, and I should say that if I was a psychologist, that means assigning too much attention. So in the same way that the precision weighting enables that prediction error to have more effect on belief updating, you can understand this as basically I'm affording this prediction error, this bit of sensory evidence, more attention. So therefore, it's going to have greater effect upon my belief updating. If I'm a pharmacologist or a neurophysiologist, this would correspond to increasing the excitability of these neural populations reporting this prediction error. That means I'm implicitly inducing a modulatory effect, a gain effect. So that's interesting, because all the drugs that act in psychiatry and psychedelic drugs, for example, they're all very particular kinds of drugs whose site of action or mode of action is to change the excitability or the sensitivity of neuronal responses of particular cellular or neuronal populations that express the receptors to these classical neuromodulatory transmitters. So lots of converging lines of evidence suggest that the problem, the kinds of false inference of type 1 or type 2 that you would see in a human brain are due to failures of neuromodulation that are responsible for encoding the precision or uncertainty about different belief structures or representations in the brain. Anecdotally, what that would mean is that I'm affording too much weight or attention to certain sources of evidence. So say, for example, I was watching television. At the same time, I was receiving interoceptive sensations from my heart or from my intestines, from my autonomic nervous system. And I could not ignore, because I have failed to attenuate all the messages from my cardiac or autonomic nervous system, the gut feelings that are indicative of a particular state of arousal. And I'm also unable to ignore the visual and auditory sensations coming from the presenter of the news on the television. So now I have to find an explanation for this. Why is it that I feel aroused and engaged, whilst at the same time all the sensory evidence in my auditory and visual domains is telling me that this person is talking to me? It must be they're actually talking to me personally. This person is actually communicating to me and is arousing me. So the simplest explanation for this set of unattenuated sensations that cover all sorts of modalities very easily comes to mind, which from your point of view or my point of view would be a delusion, that this newscaster is talking to me personally. He actually is actually engaging with me as a person, and therefore I now have to explain, why is he doing that? Is he controlling my thoughts? And then you can elaborate that into a delusional system. So from the point of view of the person suffering the psychotic delusion, this is just the simplest explanation for what we normally ignore. So we can normally contextualize and ignore all sorts of information and just drill down on the simplest explanation. But if you can't ignore stuff, if you can't attenuate the sensory precision, for example, or you can't modulate the precision in your deep hierarchical models, you're left exposed to an overwhelming amount of data, overwhelming amount of sensory evidence that you have to somehow explain. And that would be one explanation for delusions and hallucinations. Is that the kind of answer you were looking for?
Yes. And now I am very interested in how you actually got into this research. What prompted you to first become a physician and deal with such diseases as schizophrenia, and then going on into coming up with free energy principle?
I'll try and keep the answer short. So my usual joke is, since I was a little boy, I've always wanted to study the most interesting thing in the universe, which of course is me, or at least my brain. So that's why I became a psychiatrist. But en route, I also knew that I would have to skill myself in terms of mathematics and physics. So I actually did physics, quantum physics, and probability theory at Cambridge in conjunction with psychology and physiology as part of my medical training. And then as soon as possible, got into psychiatric research. But en route, found myself spending 2 years in a therapeutic community with a large community of people with chronic schizophrenia. And that was an incredibly useful and de-skilling but enriching experience, which since that time I've always been committed to try to understand how the brain works in order to understand what it must be like to be schizophrenic, or understand the mechanism that underwrite that kind of false inference and all the attendant suffering, or not. Not all people schizophrenia suffer, but some of them do. And that explains why at every stage in my career as a researcher and a theoretician, I've tried to focus on how the brain works, either using empirical approaches like brain imaging or theoretical or analytic mathematical approaches of the kind that we've been talking about. One final point is I was just lucky enough to get into research at the inception of human brain mapping, and that presents a very similar problem to which you and I face, in the sense that there's lots of data available of a very high dimensionality that we have to make sense of. So the mathematics that we've been talking about in terms of you and your brain and my brain making sense of our sensory input onto the sensory sector of the Markov blanket is exactly the same problem that early brain imaging analysts were facing when making sense of this vast amount of high dimensional data from continuous measurements of brain activation. So the same procedures that were subsequently used to model belief updating in the brain were actually originally developed and deployed in order to make sense using generative models of signals from the brain. So sort of curious twist, but that was the foundational structure of my career.
So do you believe that your principle would be kind of used to create conscious models? Or would you say that also LLMs would be kind of conscious?
Again, that's a challenging and question, which would take about an hour to properly. You should have an entire podcast series on that one. And there are lots of people with opinions about this, so don't take my opinion seriously. There are lots of people who spend their entire lives talking about this. So to answer the first part of the question, the free energy principle is not a theory of consciousness. It's a principle, and a principle is a method in physics, which means you could apply the free energy principle if you wanted to build a conscious artifact.
Yeah.
How would you do that? The free energy principle does not tell you how to do that. So the free energy principle is like the theory of, or the principles of natural selection, or the theory of natural selection, to be more precise. It tells you the mechanics, and you can certainly use it to explain things, but it doesn't tell you how to build an eye or speak French, in the same way the free energy principle itself doesn't tell you how to build a conscious artifact. But it does tell you, I think gives you lots of clues as to what you'd have to do first. I think we've covered those in terms of being an agent. I think, to be conscious would have, I'd have to have agency, that private notion that I can author my own future. And then you think about, well, what would you need to have in order to have self-modeling, and then what would you need on top of that in terms of your generative model to be aware that you are a self and that you are modeling. So it does, the kinds of questions that you get when you apply the free energy principle to truly sentient, authentic agents they provide potential answers to questions about the structure of the generative model. And there is interesting work along those lines in terms of things like Chris Field's inner screen hypothesis, or the work by people like Thomas Metzinger and Lars Sanford-Smith in terms of computational neurophenomenology. There are ongoing research collaborations of an adversarial sort, pitching things like active inference and the free energy principle against integrated information theory. So there is a lot of work in that space. But I repeat, the free energy principle itself is just a tool. It's just a method. Large language models, yeah, I sometimes think I'm just a wonderful large language model, and there are other times when I think, well, actually, large language models are not quite there yet because they don't have agency in the sense that we were talking about.
Yeah. That is correct, yes. I'm sorry, I phrased the question a little bit in an awkward way.
No, it wasn't at all.
But maybe before we wrap up, I would like to ask you, what is next for research? Is there anything exciting coming, or something in general that you are very excited about? Could be outside of this principle.
Yeah, well, I'm too old to get too excited, but I'm certainly easily engaged in lots of things because I essentially do what people want me to, or what I'm told. At the moment, what I've been told to focus on, or what I infer I should be focusing on, given the current direction of travel among my colleagues, collaborators, and students, is the problem of structure learning. So we've been talking very much about sort of belief updating given a particular structure, although we did foray into assembly theory and assembling the right kinds of structures. So I'm very interested in a sort of at the moment solving the problem of how you would assemble the right kind of generative model with the right kind of structure, exactly in the spirit of assembly theory. But in this instance, under the constraint, it has to be a generative model of some lived world. And can you do that from scratch? Can you grow a model as opposed to a large language model where you prune it and reduce it? So say a foundation model becomes expert and apt and fit for purpose for a particular application domain by basically waves of possibly distilled reinforcement learning, which basically increase the sparsity of the connections that in exactly the way we were talking about before. But they do that by pruning away what is redundant to reveal the underlying sparsity in the causal structure that allows them to predict the next token. The alternative approach is to a certain extent, what we do as children or as neonates is learn our model and grow it as we go. So I'm particularly intrigued at the moment as to the principles and the realization of the ability to actually grow a model and explore different hypothesis space, not in terms of predetermined structures, but in terms of exploring the very structures themselves, something that Josh Tenenbaum refers to as sort of growing a mind.
Very interesting. All right. So, yeah, now final question. Would you recommend any books, podcasts, or something for anyone who is further interested in your work, or just anything that you find interesting?
Right. I find lots of things interesting. If you want to read about applying the free energy principle to motivated or sentient behavior, then my very brilliant PhD student, who's actually a neurologist, who's quite a mature PhD student and has gone back to neurology training, Thomas Parr, and my great friend Giovanni Pizzulo, we wrote a book. I wasn't allowed to write it. They had to write it because I talked too much. They wrote a book called Active Inference. So I would recommend that as a sort of, not a nice read, but certainly an accessible read that introduces you to the fundamentals of much of what we have been talking about.
Yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic book for anyone who is further interested in your work. All right. Thank you very much for joining the podcast and taking the time to answer my questions. It was a pleasure having you.
Well, thank you very much. I've greatly enjoyed our conversation. I'm still mindful we didn't do the stirring the cup of coffee and solenoidal flow. Perhaps we do that next time.